Mm-hmm. you very much for your generous introduction. I'd like to thank all of you for coming this evening. I'm very grateful to Cabrini for the invitation to speak to you about Pacem and Terris. In particular, I want to thank Dr. Burke, Executive Director of the Wolfington Center, and his staff for arranging for me to commemorate this magnificent encyclical with you upon its 50th anniversary. There have been events commemorating Pacem and Terris in the last year and a half at the United Nations and at the Vatican, which tells us about the importance of this encyclical. It also tells us that we're in good company, right? They've done this at the Vatican, at the UN. Now we're doing it here. We're in good company. So I'm going to speak briefly about the context, reception, and the impact of Pacem and Terris. Next, I'll move into a discussion of the encyclical's natural law foundations for human rights. Then I'll focus on the importance of economic rights. I'll give specific attention to the encyclical's implications for the right to education and workers' rights in our present context in the United States. Finally, I'll conclude with a word about the significance of John the 23rd's spirit of dialogue and solidarity for us today. So first, the context and the reception of the encyclical. Not long ago, legal historian John Whitty stated that, quote, "Religions will not be easy allies to engage, but the struggle for human rights cannot be won without them," end quote. While this may be the case for some religions today, it can hardly be said about the Roman Catholic tradition. Many observers, such as political scientist Samuel Huntington, have rightly acknowledged that in the 20th century, in the latter part of the 20th century, Catholicism became a leading force for the promotion of human rights. As many of you know, Pope John Paul II traveled the world and wrote many important documents to champion the rights of all people. It was therefore only fitting that in 2011, the United Nations honored Pope John Paul as a, quote, "consistent promoter of peace and human rights," end quote. There was a time, however, when Catholicism did not embrace many of the rights contained in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In particular, the Church did not accept what are referred to commonly as civil and political rights, such as the right to religious freedom. As late as the 1950s, the Catholic Church silenced John Courtney Murray, the Jesuit priest and theologian, for his defense of religious freedom. However, the Church's stance changed definitively with Pope John the 23rd and his encyclical Pacem and Terris. It is no exaggeration to say that Pacem and Terris brought about a sea change in the Roman Catholic tradition. It contained the first affirmation of religious liberty in official Catholic teaching, which was then more fully expounded at Vatican II. Often deemed Catholicism's Magna Carta, it is the most systematic and extensive presentation of rights and duties in the Catholic social tradition. Pacem and Terris also paved the way for an official recognition of the legitimacy of Christian pacifism, which took place at Vatican II. In addition, the encyclical broadened the subject of Catholic social teaching to the international sphere by calling for a universal common good and a worldwide community of nations. Pacem and Terris had a major impact both within and beyond the confines of the Catholic Church. John the 23rd wanted to diffuse the tensions of the Cold War. He intervened during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 by personally appealing to both President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev to avert war. His desire to help end the Cold War and promote peaceful conflict resolution prompted him to pen this encyclical. It was officially promulgated shortly before Easter in 1963. From the very first words, Pacem and Terris signaled a major shift in papal teaching. For the first time, never before had a pope addressed an encyclical to, quote, all men, we would add, of course, women, of goodwill. John the 23rd used this formulation to convey his keen interest in cooperation among Catholics and non-Catholics alike in the urgent endeavor of building peace. In doing so, the Pope achieved his goal of reaching people outside the Church. As Peter Steinfels has pointed out, quote, "Pacem and Terris was embraced by non-Catholic readers like no previous papal encyclical," end quote. The entire text was printed in the New York Times, along with several editorials on it. It was positively received in the Soviet Union as well. The encyclical did, however, have its critics. Renowned theologians such as Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich bemoaned John the 23rd's naive optimism concerning the ability to promote peace and justice and overcome the Cold War exclusively through nonviolent means. Even some Catholics were skeptical of the Pope's utopian vision, including some high-ranking prelates in Rome. Nonetheless, Pacem and Terris profoundly changed the landscape of Catholic thinking on human rights. It was an impetus for the promotion of human rights for Catholic bishops' conferences around the world. It also inspired lay and ordained Catholics in myriad nations to struggle for human rights. In places such as Poland, Chile, South Korea, El Salvador, the Philippines, and elsewhere. For example, Cardinal Stefan Wyszynski of Poland criticized the communist regime there by explicitly appealing to Pacem and Terris in his defense of human rights and duties that inhere in the nature of the human person. Likewise, Archbishop Oscar Romero quoted Pope John the 23rd in defending the, quote, right of assembly and association, end quote, which the Salvadoran regime had brutally suppressed in the 1970s and 80s. In recent years, the encyclical has inspired a global movement called the Pacem and Terris Global Leadership Ecumenical Initiative. According to Dr. Joe Holland, one of its founding members, and I quote, Pope John's prophetic vision seeks a purified and updated world church, serving a humanistic and ecological global civilization beyond modern ideologies and grounded in justice, peace, and agroecology. Wow. I'm glad Professor Holland said that because I certainly couldn't muster that much eloquence myself. However, I do agree with his assessment of Pope John the 23rd and his encyclical. Now I want to dive into Pacem and Terris's argument pertaining to human rights. In particular, look at the foundation for human rights as Pope John describes it, now that I've discussed the context. Many helpful commentaries have already summarized the overall argument of the encyclical, so I will not go through the entire argument, the overall argument. Rather, I'm going to focus on a few of its key ideas regarding human rights and their significance for today. Catholic law professor and human rights scholar Mary Ann Glendon has recently argued that philosophical relativism presents perhaps the most complicated challenge facing the human rights project at the present time. If Glendon and the many other critics of postmodern epistemology are correct, there is no basis for arguing for universal human rights. As many commentators have pointed out, the postmodern world in which we live holds that truth, linguistic meaning, moral values, and human nature no longer have stable meanings. If we cannot claim that all human beings possess certain attributes in all cultures, in all times, in all places, we cannot, and in some real sense, all human beings share a common human nature, we cannot argue for universal human rights. If human nature is entirely malleable, human persons have correspondingly malleable worth and social utility. In other words, the defense of universal human rights depends on acknowledging some universal truths about the subjects of human rights, i.e., human persons. Natural law functions in this way in Catholic social teaching on human rights. Pacem and Terris elaborated the most systematic exposition of natural law as the foundation for human rights in modern Catholic social teaching. At the very outset of the encyclical, Pope John contends that there is a, quote, astonishing order in the universe that reflects the mind of God. The first four parts of the encyclical deal with the order of relationships between individuals, the order of relationships within a state, the order of relationships between states, and the order of relationships between individuals, the state, and the international community as a whole. Citing Romans chapter 2, verse 15, John argues that God has, quote, imprinted in the human being's heart an order which his conscience reveals to him and enjoins him to obey, end quote. The order found in the universe is reflected in the human person and is the basis of the human person's inviolable dignity. This dignity is the basis of an array of rights. In other words, the laws governing the relationships between humans and between states are rooted in the very nature of the human person. Who is this human person? What does it mean to say all human beings have human dignity? Pacem and Terris fleshes out what it means to say that human beings possess dignity and why human dignity commands the recognition of rights and duties. In other words, it spells out the anthropological bases of Catholic human rights theory. Now, I've tried to put some of this here. As I see it, there are four components of the anthropological theory of human rights laid out in Pacem and Terris. First, the teleological nature of the human being. This means that by nature, human beings are meant to flourish, grow, and develop toward certain ends. We all have certain inclinations towards which we develop, towards which we grow. And from those inclinations, we can derive moral norms. We can derive human rights. Okay? So how the ends towards which human nature tends and how inherent human capacities must be protected and fostered determines the scope of human rights and thus the demands of human dignity. The discussion of specific rights in Pacem and Terris spells out the demands of human dignity, i.e. the scope of human rights. So just to give you a couple of examples, Pope John states, "From the dignity of the human person, there also arises the right to carry on economic activities according to the degree of responsibility of which one is capable." He also states that from the dignity of the human person flows the right to participation in the life of the community and the right to contribute to the common good. He also points to the right by the natural law, to use his language, to an opportunity to work and perform one's job duties without coercion. So each right is grounded in the natural law, which holds that each human being has inviolable human dignity and therefore human rights. And John seeks to show how human dignity demands a whole myriad of human rights. And I'll talk about particular rights a little bit later. Second, human beings are endowed with unique relational, rational, moral, and spiritual capacities. So from Pacem and Terris, quote, "Every human being is a person, that is, his nature is endowed with intelligence and free will." Because we have intelligence, because we want to know, we have a right to education, for example. Human beings have a transcendent dimension. In other words, what they do and what they can know in the present lifetime transcends in some way earthly life. Here we see the foundation for the right to religious freedom. So John states, quote, "There is a need that is congenital to human nature and never becomes extinguished, compelling the human person to break through the web of error and open his mind to the knowledge of truth." This is a claim about human nature. And again, this claim about human nature leads Pope John to posit all human beings have a right to education. I'll talk more about that right in a few minutes. Finally, the fourth characteristic or attribute of the human person, the ends towards which human beings tend can only be achieved in community because we are social by nature. You know, John Donne's famous saying, "No man, no person is an island." From Pacem and Terris, Pope John states, quote, "Since men are social by nature, they are meant to live with others and to work for one another's welfare." This anthropology undergirds the claim that because a person has human dignity, others must respect and protect that human dignity. Pacem and Terris thus states, quote, "For every fundamental human right draws its indestructible moral force from the natural law, which in granting it imposes a corresponding obligation," end quote. To put it another way, Pacem and Terris expresses what it means to be a human being normatively. All human beings have certain rights and obligations flowing directly from their human nature. Those things that are necessary for all human beings to flourish determine the scope of human rights. Pacem and Terris lists myriad human rights, again, some of which I'll discuss in greater detail momentarily. For now, it is important to note, as Jesuit theologian David Hollenbach has stated, that the, quote, "the thread which ties all these rights together is human dignity." Human dignity is not an abstract or ethereal reality, but is realized in concrete conditions of personal, social, economic, and political life. The history of papal teaching has been a process of discovering and identifying these conditions of humanity, these conditions are called human rights. In other words, modern Catholic social teaching has sought to discern through the use of observation, experience, reason, those things that are necessary for the protection and flourishing of human right in certain contexts, in certain milieu and conditions. The natural law argument for the basis of human rights in Pacem and Terris has several advantages, in my view. First, it creates a stable and coherent foundation for universal human rights by providing an alternative to the postmodern worldview that truth, human nature, and morality are contingent all the way down. Second, it circumvents a critique that has often been rendered against human dignity as the foundation of human rights. The philosopher Alan Gewirth has stated that a human right can be captured with this formulation, which I have written here. A, representing a person, has a right to something, X, against another person, B, or group of persons, by virtue of Y. This is the formal structure of a human right. Many thinkers have criticized this human dignity paradigm that I've been talking about because in their eyes it lacks logical force. One kind of objection is that there is a missing logical step. So it's one thing to say that person A possesses human dignity and that therefore person A has a right to a good from another person or group of persons. In other words, that a person or group of persons owes something to someone else and has a duty out of justice to provide it or help to fulfill it. The logical step, which some have pointed to, that is missing is that human dignity doesn't necessarily require us to recognize the rights of others. So there's a missing or intermediary step. Human dignity requires recognition by others. This is something that a number of philosophers have pointed to. I contend, however, that this type of criticism fails to see the connection between human rights, the common good, and the social anthropology articulated, for example, by Roman Catholic thought. John the 23rd's claim that, quote, since men and women are social by nature, they are meant to live with others and to work for another's welfare, fills in this putative logical gap. It legitimates the move from A has human dignity to person A has a right to a certain good from a group of persons. Provided that we demonstrate, of course, that this particular good is necessary for the rights bearer's flourishing and the protection of his or her dignity. Given the rich social anthropology of Pacem and Terris as a backdrop, it should be easy to apprehend why the move from human dignity to human rights and duties is valid. The person A of formal logic becomes a human being in the personalist communitarian sense typical of Roman Catholic thought, most beautifully expressed by Pope John in Pacem and Terris. Human beings by nature can only flourish by living with and for one another. Simply put, John the 23rd provides a lucid and elegant corrective to the hyper-individualistic, solipsistic, NIMBY, i.e. not in my backyard, understanding of human nature and human purpose so prevalent in the United States and elsewhere today. And Dr. Burke and I were talking over dinner about a wonderful book by a thinker, E.J. Dionne, Our Divided Political Heart, in which Mr. Dionne describes how individualism has overtaken the communitarian ethos in the United States in the last several decades. So I recommend that book if you'd like to learn about this individualistic ethos which dominates the United States today, but has not always dominated our culture and our history. Pacem and Terris provides a cohesive vision of a just society based on solidarity. Each member is guaranteed certain rights while being required to perform duties in the service of the common good. Quote, the common good is chiefly guaranteed when personal rights and duties are maintained. End quote. So, have I put you to sleep yet? You might say at this point, so what? Why is it necessary to provide a foundation for human rights? Can't we just live and let live? The problem is that theoretical debates, which sometimes can be rather abstract and seem almost heartless and cold, have real life, in fact, dire consequences for real people. We don't recognize our duties to one another. There are serious and dire consequences. Hundreds of millions of people have died, and the vast majority of the world's population today struggles to survive daily because they have been deprived of the rights enshrined in Pacem and Terris and in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In this section, I want to talk about Pacem and Terris's what we might call defense of both bread and freedom, defense of economic rights and defense of civil and political rights. And Dr. Burke had already intimated something about this issue in his introduction. 22 million people perish due to a lack of resources in just 1 year. According to World Bank data, about 1.4 billion people live in extreme poverty, surviving on less than $1.25 a day. Approximately 2.5 billion people, or 47% of the world's population, live below the $2 a day poverty standard. More than 70 million children are denied the right to education globally, even though much progress has been made on that front, while more than 700 million adults remain illiterate, according to UNESCO. UNICEF reports that about 24,000 children die each day due to preventable causes. Roughly 100 million women have died prematurely, due primarily to neglect of female health care and nutrition, especially during childhood. Meanwhile, the nations of the world spend $1,514 billion annually on military spending. Before I came here tonight, I was practicing some math with my 8-year-old daughter, and I tried to explain to her the magnitude of that number, $1,514 billion. I can't grasp it myself. This is spent on military spending. So you can see here that the United States spends the lion's share by far at $693.6 billion. The rest of the world, $286.5, and you have the further breakdown here. All this money could obviously be spent to help fulfill the rights of those people who are in a dire situation. So these statistics show, the point here is that, for example, ending world hunger would only take a very small sliver of this dollar figure. The UN has estimated that it would cost $30 billion to end world hunger, experienced by 850 million people daily. So a drop in the bucket compared to annual military spending. These statistics show that the rights of vast swaths of the world's population remain empty promises. In large part, this is due to indifference and inaction, not lack of resources. The debates about economic rights are not merely academic. The fate of billions of people rests on whether or not human rights are accepted and implemented. Accepting John the 23rd's vision of human rights and duties arising out of the very nature of the human person remains an urgent task. In addition to the issues about a foundation and providing a stable foundation for human rights, which, by the way, that issue was debated during the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was a very contentious issue. There's also been a long-standing debate about the scope of human rights. It started during the very drafting of the UN Universal Declaration and persists to this day, as Dr. Burke mentioned. The UDHR ushered in a new era for human rights, but the Cold War years exacted a toll. The Soviet Union alleged that the U.S. denied its citizens economic rights. On the other hand, the U.S. decried the violation of civil and political rights in the Soviet Union, thus attempting to claim the high moral ground. This led to the creation of two separate covenants in 1966, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The United States, as some of you probably know, has opposed the recognition of economic rights ever since. No U.S. president has urged ratification of this ICESCR since President Carter's futile attempt to do so. The U.S. even voted against a resolution to acknowledge a human right to adequate nutrition at a session of the UN Human Rights Commission. Subsequently, the United States was kicked off of the UN's Human Rights Commission. The U.S. has denied that, hasn't signed on to the treaty on women's rights, on children's rights, etc. To make matters worse, some Catholic thinkers have also opposed economic rights. For example, the influential Catholic thinker Michael Novak worries that the acknowledgement of human rights will lead to a culture of dependency and an oversized welfare state. On the other hand, as I said earlier, official Catholic teaching for many years, for many decades, rejected political and civil rights. Leo XIII's encyclical in 1896, Rerum Novarum, already endorsed many of the economic rights, such as a right to a just wage and the right to form unions. In other words, Catholic social teaching first advocated economic, social, and social rights, and only later endorsed, much later, endorsed civil and political rights. Pacem and Terris thus represents the first listing, the first endorsement of both sets of rights in official Catholic teaching. John the 23rd, like the UDHR, which he deemed an act of the highest importance, that's a quote, embraced both groups of rights. Now, I've borrowed a chart from David Hollenbach, the Jesuit thinker and Catholic social ethicist, which captures the full panoply of rights that are endorsed in Pacem and Terris. So you have communication rights, according to Hollenbach's schema, communication rights, bodily rights, political rights, rights of movement, so for example, the right to emigrate and immigrate, associational rights, the right to assembly, the right to form unions, economic rights, such as the right to work, sexual and family rights, and religious rights. And all of these rights flow from human dignity, which again is rooted in the nature of the human person. Now, the endorsement of both sets of rights may give fits to Catholics like Novak and others, but to the billions of people suffering from economic deprivations around the world, John the 23rd preached the good news. Every official document of Catholic social teaching has since endorsed the full catalog of rights named in Pacem and Terris. Moreover, although much work remains to be done, Catholic groups and agencies such as Catholic Relief Services stand today at the forefront of promoting economic rights. While Catholics can debate how to make sense of economic rights conceptually and debate how best to fulfill them, they need not waste time debating whether or not they exist. John the 23rd definitively settled that issue. What Catholics need to do is to promote the economic rights of all, especially the poor and marginalized, as the principle of solidarity and the option for the poor requires. According to Pope John, the fulfillment of these rights is the linchpin of peace. Empirical realities today seem to lend credence to Pope John's claim. In 2012, Israel was the only highly developed country, according to the UN's HDI, or Human Development Index, which experienced armed conflict. Just one country, highly developed in the entire world, experiencing armed conflict. 75% of countries with armed conflict are either in the low development category, so 44%, or medium development, 31%. In other words, countries that are considered low development are at much greater risk of experiencing armed conflict. The empirical realities bear this out, seeming to, again, validate John's claim that the linchpin of peace is the promotion of human rights. I'd like to focus now on one particular right for a few moments, if I can, the right to education. In adopting Catholic social teaching's preferential option for the poor, Catholics should advocate the right to education of the economically disadvantaged. Because of the relationship between education levels and financial livelihood, realizing the right to education is crucial for the poor. Attainment of education fosters the ability to fulfill other rights, such as the right to work, to a just wage, and the right to participation in all levels of society. Although many places in Catholic social teaching refer to the right to education, Pope John the 23rd emphasized it more loosely in Pacem and Terris than anywhere else in official Catholic social teaching. It is therefore worth quoting the entire passage from Pacem and Terris, number 13. John writes, "The natural law also gives man the right to share in the benefits of culture and therefore a right to a basic education and to technical and professional training in keeping with the stage of educational development of the country to which he or she belongs. Every effort should be made to ensure that persons be enabled on the basis of merit." Are the admissions people listening? "To go on to higher studies so that, as far as possible, they may occupy posts and take on responsibilities in human societies in accordance with their natural gifts and the skills they have acquired." End of quote. In my estimation, Catholic primary and secondary schools have historically empowered the poor, I think there's evidence to show this, who would otherwise have little chance to receive a quality education, particularly in the inner cities. However, as I have argued in several recent published articles, realities in contemporary American society make including higher education in the right to education more urgent than ever, and certainly more urgent than in John's day. Higher education has increasingly become a privilege of the wealthy in the United States. I described this in some of the articles that I've published. For example, according to a recent report on flagship public universities published by the Educational Trust, 44 out of 50 schools have fewer low-income students today than they did in 1992. Furthermore, a college degree is the single largest predictor of the ability to escape poverty and marginalization in the United States. According to the U.S. Department of Education, the median income of college alumni was $45,000 in 2009. For high school graduates, it dropped to $30,000. For those without a high school diploma, $21,000. In other words, it's simple. The less education you have, the more likely you are to fall below the federal poverty line, the more likely you are in danger to fall into poverty. Although some Catholic colleges and universities have done a good job recruiting, admitting, and retaining economically disadvantaged students. However, many Catholic universities are failing in this regard. For example, the University of Notre Dame has the largest endowment of all Catholic universities at more than $6 billion currently. Yet, only 12% of its student body receives Pell Grants, which is the standard measure of economic diversity or the prevalence of low-income students on a college campus. Compare that to Amherst College, which has 21%, or Seton Hall's 28%. Boston College, with a $1.6 billion endowment, has only 13% of Pell recipients. Georgetown follows with the next largest endowment with 10%. St. Joseph's University, Loyola University of Maryland, Providence College, Villanova, all Catholic universities, of course, unfortunately they occupy 4 of the 5 lowest places on U.S. News and World Report's Economic Diversity Index. 4 out of the 5 lowest. In other words, there is a dearth of students at these institutions, Catholic institutions, who hail from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, I'm happy to say that Cabrini College is doing better at 24%, lest you ask me to leave immediately if I say otherwise. Some schools are even excelling, such as St. Peter's College with 45%, Xavier University of Louisiana with 59%, and Trinity University of Washington, D.C. with 64%. In short, I would contend that John the 23rd's call for greater access to higher education for the poor has been recognized by some Catholic universities and colleges. However, other institutions have demonstrated less of a commitment to it vis-a-vis other institutional priorities, such as, I'm sure many of you can fill in the blank, expensive building projects, exorbitant administrators and salaries and athletic coaches' salaries, heavily merit-based financial aid policies as opposed to need-based financial aid policies. So I think, in short, some colleges need to heed the call of John the 23rd a little bit more closely and intently. I also want to spend a little bit of time, if I have a few moments, to speak about workers' rights and Pacem and Terris' call to defend workers' rights. John expressed confidence that, quote, the working classes have gradually gained ground in economic affairs, end quote. He argued that over time, workers were able to claim their economic, political, and cultural rights. while we can debate whether or not that was true in Pope John's day, we now live in a world where the dignity and rights of workers are under assault. In the United States, the average hourly compensation has remained stagnant since 1977, even though worker productivity has steadily risen since 1947. The median wage for males, about $45,000 in 2007, is less than 30 years ago, adjusted for inflation. For females, who still earn 77 cents for every dollar males earn, the median wage is considerably lower. The minimum wage plummeted in real value, stuck at $5.15 until 2007. American families worked 500 more hours than they did in 1979, but they barely earn more today. More than 46 million Americans live in poverty. Among working-age adults, 3/4 of the poor work. They rank among the working poor, but do not earn enough to stay above the federal poverty line. The desperation of workers in many underdeveloped countries is even worse. For example, Disney workers in Bangladesh were paid 12 cents an hour, while the CEO of Disney took home about $63,000 per hour. Nike workers in Indonesia make $4.76 per day, or $811 annually, while its CEO reaped fourth quarter dividend earnings of $80 million. At a textile factory jointly owned by dictators in Burma and the U.S. government, workers earn 7 cents per hour. In short, the wages of workers who make most of the goods that we buy in the United States are consigned to a life of destitution. Many workers are also denied their rights to a safe work environment. Exposure to toxins and unsafe conditions cause diseases and early mortality for countless laborers in underdeveloped nations. American workers also regularly face what labor law expert James A. Gross has called, quote, violations of the right to life and limb, end quote, because OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, has become inept at ensuring workplace safety. Approximately 65,000 American workers die annually from work-related illnesses or injuries, Gross tells us. Many workers, as you know, cannot join unions to force employers, or at least try to encourage employers, to maintain safety standards, which some companies see as a threat to their profits. In Bangladesh, a group of garment workers who tried to organize a couple of years ago were jailed and were even facing the death penalty. Efforts to unionize are often violently squelched in Latin America and Asia. And of course, as you know, union busting is not foreign to our own soil. Union membership has dwindled in the United States to less than 7% of the private workforce. This led Human Rights Watch to report that Workers' Freedom Association is, quote, under sustained attack in the United States, end quote. So I think there's more here, but I think you get the picture. Workers, anybody who tells you that workers have it good in the United States and elsewhere are wrong. And the call to protect workers' rights is more urgent than ever. So I argue it is imperative that Catholics and all people of goodwill stand in solidarity with workers by promoting workers' rights. According to John the 23rd, those rights include the rights to employment, work without coercion, safe working conditions, a just wage, unemployment, disability, and retirement benefits, the right to unionize, and the right to collective bargaining. I also contend that Catholics should first and foremost ask themselves whether or not all employees at their own institutions are afforded these rights. Sadly, union busting has taken place at Catholic hospitals, schools, and several Catholic universities in recent times. Should I name names? It is obvious that the right to a just wage for all workers is not respected by Catholic employers. Just take, for example, the thousands of adjunct faculty, food service workers, janitorial staff, and security officers on our campuses who often make below a living wage in their region. In short, much work needs to be done in this area in order to honor the legacy of Pope John the 23rd on human rights. And I promise you this is my concluding section. I just want to say a brief word about John the 23rd's method of dialogue in solidarity. Much more could be said, of course, about Pacem and Terris and its implications for today. I've overlooked much. I just want to conclude, as I said, with some remarks about dialogue. Pope John saw himself as a, quote, humble servant of the entire human family, end quote. According to his biographer, shortly before his death, he proclaimed that, quote, now more than ever, we are called to serve the human person as such, and not merely Catholics, to defend above all and everywhere the rights of the human person, and not merely those of the Catholic Church, end quote. As Drew Christensen S.J. has written, Pope John, quote, displayed the bonhomie of his peasant upbringing and an abiding trust in the goodness of ordinary people, end quote. This allowed him to engage in personal dialogue with President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev alike. At the time, many at the Vatican were deeply worried about Catholics collaborating with socialists and communists in practical matters. Pope John, however, distinguished between erroneous ideas and people who hold them. People who hold mistaken views retain their dignity and must, quote, be always regarded and treated in accordance with that lofty dignity, end quote. Moreover, John paved the way for collaboration with socialists, for example, who may hold, as he stated, false philosophical teachings, but also have, quote, elements that are positive and deserving of approval, end quote. According to Pope John, the Church does retain the right and duty to discuss the applications of its principles of ethics and religion to the political, social, and economic issues. However, the virtue of prudence should guide Catholics in deciding when to find common cause with those who reject the Church's teaching in order to, quote, achieve economic, social, cultural, and political ends which are honorable and useful, end quote. John argues that in particular, experts in those realms are called to decide, lay experts, are called to decide when such collaboration might be fruitful and legitimate. In my opinion, the Church today desperately needs people like Pope John, as does our society and our world. In a church deeply divided by ideological rifts, Catholics should emulate his spirit of dialogue and solidarity with those who differ politically and ideologically, both within and beyond the Church. There are examples, fortunately, of leaders in the Church today who exemplify this spirit. For example, in regard to the recent debate about the HHS so-called contraception mandate, Bishop Robert Lynch of St. Petersburg, Florida, acknowledged the positive steps that have been taken by the Obama administration to accommodate the concerns of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops and Catholics who share those concerns. Bishop Lynch also stated, and I quote, perhaps we bishops need a little more humility from time to time, recognizing that we are not the only game in town, but that there are other players, women and men of great faith who also love the Church and who can speak for themselves and their organizations on what effect legislation, proposed legislation, and regulations will have on their ministry. A more collaborative effort might lead to greater results, end quote. In a church with so many wounds among its faithful, building upon the legacy of John the 23rd's approach to dialogue is critical. As Father Józef Tischner put it in his description of the methods of the Polish Solidarność movement, Solidarity, quote, the first condition of dialogue is an ability to feel the viewpoint of another. The recognition that someone else, from his or her point of view, is always to some extent right, end quote. Dialogue also requires that we acknowledge that we are not entirely right. We must be, as Tischner states, ready to, quote, rise above ourselves, reaching for a common and single point of view on things and events, end quote. This does not mean, of course, that we abandon the search for truth. However, we must accept that our side does not hold a monopoly on the truth. Keep in mind that Tischner uttered these words during the heated days of Solidarność in 1981, which was struggling with the communist regime and its oppression in Poland. While he clearly talked about the exploitation of workers and other forms of oppression, he was also able to say, quote, as long as I look at myself exclusively with my own eyes, I only know part of the truth. The full truth is the fruit of our experiences in common, yours about me, mine about you. Dialogue is a building of reciprocity, end quote. Remarkable that he said that during the days of the Solidarity movement in its struggles with the communist regime. This was the spirit of the Solidarity movement, and it was the spirit of Pope John the 23rd who allowed the Spirit to work through him in wondrous ways. May we hope and pray that we may do the same. Thank you. Absolutely. I'll do my best. Yes, sir. So I think that's absolutely true. I have to admit that, as you might be able to tell from my final remarks, I've been inspired by the Polish Catholics in the Solidarity movement, like Tishner and many others, some of whom I met. I spent a number of hours with Tishner before he died. And so I've drawn personal inspiration from them, their stories, their heroicism, their courage, because essentially, and folks, we can think about folks like Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, Cesar Chavez, people who were likewise inspired by Catholic social teaching to take risks and to adopt the virtue of courage. And because it does take courage to stand on the side of truth and to stand in solidarity with those who are oppressed. We know that from those of us who are Christian, we know from our faith that this is going to often bring upon us suffering. Right? I mean, Christ says it himself in the gospel that if you follow me, you're likely to suffer. And so I think it's important to look to those real life figures who found a way to live in these, what we often call in Catholic theology, in between times. We live in a broken world, but we also live in a place that Jesus said, about which Jesus said the kingdom has begun in an incipient way. So we can look at people who have learned to negotiate that and live out their faith in concrete ways. I think that's very, very important. Yes. Yeah, I do, and I wrestle with it myself. And to be perfectly honest, if you ask me one day, I might be completely negative and say there's very little hope. I might wake up the next day and see something that I hadn't seen before and say, well, there's reason to hope. To start, I would say, even though the numbers that I presented are quite negative, we do have to look at the progress that's been made. So, for example, in the area of women's rights, I think much work needs to be done, but it's undeniable that a lot of progress has been made. In the area of the right to education, at least primary education, the numbers are quite encouraging. And so people, I think about it this way, as bad as it may be today, where would we be without this? Where would we be without the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Where would we be without the Catholic tradition finally getting on board? As Dr. Burke said, we were certainly latecomers to the party. But once we got there, we sort of came in with a bang. I mean, Pope John the 23rd and then Pope John Paul II, whom has been lauded by people outside the Catholic Church often for being the human rights pope. So where would we be without this tradition? So looking at, on the macro level at the improvements that have been made and saying, okay, we've regressed in some ways, we've stagnated in some ways, but what we have made, progress can be made, and here's the evidence. Then on the micro level, or on the local or community level, I just learned from union organizers a little bit about this. I was recently involved in a campaign to promote the rights of workers at hotels across the country. And it was sort of a complex campaign because it involved Catholic universities investing in a corporation that was mistreating its workers. And so the effort was twofold, to get the workers a better life and a better situation in hotels, but also to promote divestment, for example, at the University of Notre Dame. And I stepped into this, I came into this late in the game. The campaign went on for 6 years. But in the end, there was success. There was success. And I learned from the workers involved, the union organizers, and the students, you really have to be in for the long haul. You have to expect that you're going to fail often. Now, I'm a very impatient person. I want results. I want to write my paper, publish it, move on to the next one, or be involved in this campaign, achieve it, and move on. But I learned that you have to develop a thick skin, and you have to be patient and insistent, and also creative. I mean, I'm slowly learning as I move into a greater advocacy role that this is important, the theoretical is important, the tradition is important, but we have to learn the principles of organizing and marry the two. And that was my role. I married the tradition of workers' rights with some organizing principles in this campaign in order to, as if you will, leverage the tradition against these Catholic institutions and say, hey, wait a minute. You're a Catholic university. You're investing in this corporation which is grossly mistreating its workers. Something wrong with that. Something wrong with that. So looking at the positives on the macro level, and then also looking for small successes. Yeah. It's hard to know. John the 23rd, as I tried to convey, did some amazing things. I mean, to go from 1958 and have John Courtney Murray being told by his Jesuit superiors to stop writing about religious freedom, to 1963, an official statement that all people should have the right to religious freedom, God-given right. As a Catholic, I can only explain that as grace and the working of the Holy Spirit. And so I share frankly, the frustration, some of the frustration that you expressed, that some of your colleagues have. However, what keeps me in the church is the recollection of instances like this and the belief that no matter what is going on, no matter what we think is wrong, we cannot close off room for the working of the Holy Spirit. And we can only hope and pray that the Holy Spirit will work in and through members of the church and people outside the church toward a better future. And that may seem simplistic, but if I didn't have that belief and that hope, frankly, I don't know that I'd be a Catholic today. But if you look throughout history, and I remind my students of this. My students ask me these questions all the time, and I'm very sympathetic to the anguish that they feel. If they're women, for example, I was telling folks over dinner, my 6-year-old daughter asked me, "Can women be priests?" And I said, "Well, they can in the Anglican Church, in the Lutheran Church, in the Presbyterian Church." The next question: why can't they be priests in our church? So these struggles I see from the earliest beginnings of a young woman's life. So I'm very sympathetic, and I say, first of all, sometimes we talk about the church as if those of us who are Catholic are not the church. So we are the church, and we have a responsibility to try to work for change. I mean, if my Protestant friends remind me when I'm very down and very frustrated, that if people who want change leave, it will never happen. Imagine if John Courtney Murray left and he was silent. He became the principal drafter of the Declaration Nostra Aetate, our Declaration of Religious Freedom, at Vatican II. So it's hard, it's painful, and I'm very well aware of the things that are going on in the church right now. But I think there's something to learn from Pope John and to take it forward with us. Well, certainly there could be splinter groups. I don't think there'll be a schism. I was just looking at data from the Pew Research Council today, and surprisingly, the vast majority of Catholics are actually happy with the leadership in the church. Like 71% are happy with the bishops in the United States. And I say surprisingly only because I read lots of critical pieces, whether journalistic or scholarly, and that they might lead one to think otherwise. But if you ask, again, as far as Pew gets to the pew, and ask the people in the pew, no, sorry for that, I had to say it, the numbers are quite surprising. There was a question about whether or not the next pope should lead the church in a new direction. And again, a strong majority saying no. I was surprised by that. Then you've got to think, there's another thing that I forget to do often. One of the beautiful things, most beautiful things about Roman Catholicism is we truly are a global church. You have to remember that some of the issues that we grapple with, that we deal with, that we find painful, are not live issues on the African continent, for example, where the church has been growing rapidly, right? So that's another complicating factor when you think about change. We may think about certain things that should be changed and that are appropriate in this context, in this milieu, but is the rest of the church with us? I mean, the global church on certain issues.
That leads to a thought on the right, because I do not, it appears to have picked up that side, the New York Times,
Yeah.
and and that, in other words, what you're saying is, they're not issues for those churches because they happen around the nation. Because women in those areas are Catholic. Right? And where are we going to get, where is going to be,
Well, please, I'll come back to that. Yeah.
I don't think it, I think it's a little bit careful when you make
So it's a great question. Thank you for that question. I do think that this particular encyclical, Pacem and Terris, so heavily relies on natural law that a lot of that is missing. I mean, there are references to the Bible and and Jesus Christ, but they're very few and far between, frankly. I think in John's attempt to read the signs of the times and engage them, he was really trying to dialogue with the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the people that put it forth and were trying to carry it forth. Something that, so again, he's trying to reach out to non-Catholics for the first time in the history of papal teaching. So he wants to speak a language that might, if John comes out and says, as by the way later Pope John Paul II does, human beings cannot be understood without reference to the central event in human history, namely the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ. John Paul says that you cannot understand who we are as human beings without reference to Christ. Well, that's very important, powerful language for us Christians, but for non-Christians, it may become an obstacle for collaboration, right? Now, to your question, and I love teaching about this in my classes, Catholicism's incarnational and sacramental worldview is what should lead us to this. It wasn't in the presentation because I don't really find it in the encyclical. I think Pope John Paul did much more in this regard. Redemptor Hominis, the Savior of the human person, his very first encyclical, he says, it's the principle of the incarnation. God becomes human in Jesus Christ, and Christ is in all of us. That should drive us to recognize the dignity of the human person, the presence of Christ in the other, and thereby linking love of God and love of neighbor. And so everything, and I love that encyclical because then he talks about how everything that we do should be thought about and analyzed through that lens, through that prism, that Christ takes on human form and in that way identifies with each and every one of us, is truly present in each and every one of us. Then all the theological doctrines in the Christian tradition point in the direction of trying to engage in helping to build up the kingdom of God. And this is what, there's a wonderful book called The Fullness of Faith, written by the Himes brothers, Michael and Kenneth Himes, about this. That the Christian faith is inherently social and political. Every belief in the Christian tradition, whether it's Eucharist, baptism, eschatology, you name it, has political, economic, and social ramifications. I use a wonderful book on Eucharist and social justice, the link between the celebration of the Eucharist and what that should mean for us in the world. And the author, Sister Margaret Scott, walks us through the entire liturgy, our Roman Catholic liturgy, and shows how each and every part of the liturgy. I was fascinated. I learned something, at a relatively late age about our liturgy. It is so intimately linked to concern for the world, concern for human rights. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. If I can overgeneralize, and I probably shouldn't because that's dangerous, right? Protestant theologians have been better at doing what you're asking for than Catholic theologians in general. Although, as I said, I think Pope John Paul II, moved us in the right direction. Yeah. And specialists in the discipline talk about an odd intra approach and an odd extra approach. The natural law being the odd extra approach. When we dialogue with people in the world, some of my mentors will go and testify in Congress and what have you about the rights of children Well, they're going to lead with this language so as to not alienate people in the Congress who are not Christian. But within the Christian community, we certainly have to talk about, as one person I read said, if human rights has nothing to do with the gospel of Jesus Christ, then we shouldn't be talking about it. We should be talking about them. Any other? I'm happy to. Thank you.